I was watching an episode of a 1960s TV show, The Prisoner, recently, when I noticed a very interesting looking camera being used on screen. If you haven't seen The Prisoner before, it's a 1967 miniseries which tells the story of a British agent who resigns from his job before waking up the next day finding himself a prisoner in a mysterious village. Most of the episodes in the show deal with his many attempts to escape. In the episode we're talking about today, our main character wakes up as normal, only to find the hot water, the telephone, and so on out of order. After walking around, he finds the village, his prison, usually filled with people, completely deserted. After he decides his best chance of escape is by sea, he picks up a camera in the village shop in order to take pictures of the village so he can prove when he returns home that it actually exists. The Prisoner is a science fiction show, and there were many props used in it that were clearly custom made. So when I first saw the camera, I did wonder if it was a real product or whether it was specially fabricated. Well, it turns out it is a real thing. But here it is. It's the 1963 half-frame 35mm camera, the Canon Dial 35. So what's interesting about this camera? Well, first of all, its looks. You can see it has a sort of futuristic space-age look, and you can see it looks a bit like a rotary telephone, hence the name Dial. Secondly, it's a very interesting motor drive mechanism. So a normal camera, you'll have a winder lever, which you use to wind the film onto the next frame after each exposure. A motor drive camera has an electric motor with batteries, which winds the film on to the next frame automatically after each exposure. This camera, though, instead of an electric motor drive, it has a mechanical one. So it's like a clockwork, a spring which you wind, and then you can just keep taking photos like that. So let's see if it works. So we start by removing the camera from its very nice fitted photo case, all very nice and stylish. And you can see straight away looking at the camera, it's very pretty, very beautiful. It also feels sort of satisfying and heavy in your hand. You can see at some point the previous owner had his name engraved on the back, which is quite funny. So I'll start by talking about the camera's basic controls. This dial here is the shutter speed selector dial. You only get 5 shutter speeds with this camera, a 30th to 250th of a second in the usual increments. And just below the Canon logo you see the distance selector lever. With this sort of camera you just have to guess the distance of your subjects really and hope it's fairly close. And you see here the shutter release button. And above it you see the manual aperture selector knob. The camera usually picks an aperture for you automatically based on your shutter speed selection, while the knob allows you to pick one manually based on your preference. You can see as I open the camera that the film runs from top to bottom rather than the usual left to right that you see in normal 35mm cameras like this Olympus Trip. So now it's time to try the camera with a roll of film inserted. This particular camera doesn't actually work without film, which is very unusual for 35mm cameras. It's fairly common for medium format. You see it in Pentax 6x7, Mamiya 7 and so on. The really interesting feature that this camera has is the clockwork motor drive mechanism, which is very unusual, which I'll demonstrate in a sec. So with film on the camera and the back closed, we can proceed by winding up the main spring, which runs the very unusual clockwork motor drive mechanism, and should allow us to take, according to the manual, 20 exposures continuously without the need to wind on the film after each shot at a rate of 2 per second. So it all seems to be working very nicely. You can see after each time I press the shutter button, the camera winds onto the next frame, and after roughly every 20 consecutive exposures I have to rewind the main spring. So you can see after 72 exposures the camera stops winding the film on, and it's time to rewind the film back into its cassette. So to do this we first press down the rewind button, and the camera will automatically rewind the film as far as the spring is charged. And then we finish it off by winding the knob on the bottom normally, and keep winding until the shutter counter reads 0 and the film's fully rewound. So you can see as we open the back, the film's fully rewound into its cassette, and if it was a real roll and you'd taken real pictures, you could send it off to get developed. Before we can actually use the camera though, there is a small modification which we need to make. The battery that the camera requires looks something like this. It's a mercury battery, it's quite large. Unfortunately they're not available anymore, they don't make them. The battery I do have is this, it's a 1.5 volt LR44, which is the right voltage. So what we need to make is a spacer which will allow us to use this small battery in the camera's compartment, which is meant for a much larger one. So first of all, we'll measure the diameter of spacer that we require. What I'll be using here is one of these rubber things. I'm not really sure what they're for. It's something to do with plumbing, perhaps. It's just something I have lying around in my house. So yeah, grab a couple of those. Put the battery in. And yes, they seem to fit very nicely. How many? Yeah, about 3 seems to be right. And you can see there it's more or less flush with the case. So to make our spacer, first we need a small length of ordinary solder wire. And what we do is we wrap it around the pointy part of an ordinary drawing pin. The reason I'm doing this is because obviously our rubber parts won't be enough to make electrical contact between the contact in the camera and the terminal of our battery. So we need to thread something conductive through our rubber spacers. So the next step is to glue together the rubber washers. I'm using Yoo-hoo here. There's probably a better glue. It's just what I have lying around. Then put some glue on the top and thread through our solder wire and pin. And then just pressing the washers together so that they're nicely glued and making sure they're neatly spaced one on top of the other so that it'll actually fit inside the camera's battery compartment. And then I just curl up the end of the solder wire a bit so it'll make a good contact with the battery, and then cut off the excess. And then the final step is just to file down each end of the spacer, again just so it'll make the best possible contact with the battery. Obviously it wouldn't be too difficult to make a better spacer if you soldered it and used a bit of glue, but I'm sure the spacer we made should work fine. So now the space is finished, we can put everything in the camera, starting with the battery, making sure the positive contact is facing upwards. And putting the spacer in the battery compartment, you can see everything fits very nicely. So now the light meter should be getting power, and we can give it a test and see if it's functioning as it should. So we're in the garden for this test, and you're now looking through the camera's viewfinder. Along the bottom of the viewfinder frame you should be able to make out the light meter. Now what this is supposed to do is let you know the aperture the camera has selected based on the light coming into the camera and your shutter speed selection. So now as I cycle through the camera's different speeds, you can see the needle in the light meter jumping about, which means it is working. The second feature of the viewfinder is the distance meter, which you can see along the left hand side of the frame, and you can see it moving as I focus the camera. So now we know the camera's actually working, we can now go out and take some photos. Now we're back home and the film is developed and scanned. I thought I'd talk about a couple of the photos that I thought came out particularly well. I should say, first of all, if you're interested, the film I used was Ilford FP4, which I developed at 125 with ID11 developer. So talking about this first image, this portrait, you can see you actually had a nice bokeh in the background, and overall a really nice separation between the subject and the background. The camera also gives you surprisingly good resolution and sharpness. You can almost print this photo as an 8x10. Moving on to the second photo now, this river scene. I'd actually say that the light meter in the camera was really very good. I think every photo on the roll was pretty nicely exposed. And again, the photo looks very sharp for an enlargement of an 18x24mm negative. It only really starts to look soft if you zoom in quite far. Talking more about the lens's sharpness, I'd like to compare that last photo against one from a much better camera. This photo is from a Mimir 7. This image was made from a 60x70mm negative though, so first we'll zoom into an area that roughly matches the Canon Dial's 18x24mm negative size. And looking at the two side by side now, you can see that the difference in sharpness really isn't as large as you might expect, which again goes to show the relative high quality of the Canon lens. So would I recommend that you pick up a Canon Dial 35? Well, in short, I'd say yes. They're very nice cameras to use. I really do like the half frame format, first of all. It's very nice to have 70 photos rather than the usual 35 or 10 if you're using medium format. Second of all, I really do like the mechanical motor drive. It's very nice just to snap away without having to worry about winding on the film. Next is the quality of the photos. I was quite surprised by how good they were. They look even as good as some full frame 35mm cameras I've tried before, which is very impressive. One thing, if you're thinking of getting a camera like this, a Canon Dial 35, they are very unreliable, so it is difficult to get one which is actually working. I think I had to buy 4 on eBay before I actually found one which worked properly. One good thing though is they are not too expensive, only about £40, which is quite a good price really. So that's about it, I think. That's my review, and I'll see you next time.